Before we begin with our third session, we have a video, very brief video to show you from U.S. Representative Adriano Espaillat, Democrat from New York. I'd just like to say a couple words about his bio. Representative Adriano Espaillat is the first Dominican American to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. He represents the 13th District, which includes Harlem, East Harlem, West Harlem, Hamilton Heights, Washington Heights, Inwood, Marble Hill, and the Northwest Bronx. He serves as a member of the influential U.S. House Committee on Appropriations and on the House Budget Committee. He's also Deputy Chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and is Chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute. In addition, he's a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and a senior whip of the Democratic Caucus. Representative Espaillat is actively working to pursue immigration reform, including protection for dreamers, providing a pathway to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, expanding the beneficiaries of temporary protected status, and speeding up work permits for newly arrived immigrants, to name just a few initiatives. Please join me in welcoming virtually Representative Espaillat.
Hi, this is Congressman Adriano Espaillat. I represent the 13th Congressional District of New York City, which encompasses the neighborhoods of Harlem, East Harlem, Washington Heights, Inwood, and the Northwest Bronx. I am happy to be with you today on the occasion that commemorates the centennial of the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924. I want to thank Dr. Gabriel Rosenfeld for inviting me to this symposium, and the Center for Jewish History for hosting this symposium on such an important act that marked significant legislation that profoundly influenced U.S. immigration policies for many, many years. The act imposed severe quotas on immigrant admissions for Asians, but also imposed severe restrictions for Jews trying to flee Nazi Germany. As someone that represents Washington Heights, a neighborhood that welcomed many Jews during and after the war, it is important that we continue to discuss immigration policy, as even today it is front and center of the national discourse. Many policies that are restricted to other folks from around the world are trying to be pushed today as we speak. So let's have a healthy discussion. Let's have a strong symposium on this act, and let's open up the debate for comprehensive immigration reform to be finally enacted in America. Thank you all for being part of this, and keep the faith.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're satiated and energized after your lunch. My name is Beth Wenger, and I'm a professor of American Jewish history at the University of Pennsylvania, where I'm also the graduate dean of the School of Arts and Sciences. It's my pleasure to, I think, pick up some threads that were already put down earlier with this wonderful panel, and also introduce some new ideas. So let me briefly introduce our speakers. Libby Garland, sitting to my left, is professor of history at Kingsborough Community College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's the author of After They Closed the Gates, Jewish Illegal Immigration to the United States, 1921 to 65. Mireya Loza is Associate Professor in the Department of History and the American Studies program at Georgetown University. She's the author of Defiant Braceros, How Migrant Workers Fought for Racial, Sexual, and Political Freedom. And finally, at the end, Nathaniel Deutsch is Distinguished Professor of History and Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His most recent book, co-authored with Michael Casper, is A Fortress in Brooklyn, Race, Real Estate, and the Making of Hasidic Williamsburg. So Our panel is starting with what's often called, especially in older histories, the closing of the gates. As we've heard already, they weren't really completely closed. And I feel that the Johnson-Reed Act is often discussed in terms of numbers. And of course, there was a drastic reduction of immigrants permitted in the country after Johnson-Reed. But we want to shift that focus a little bit and move beyond the numbers. And I want to ask each of you to focus on the people who remained on the move. How did migrants experience and navigate the conditions brought on by these new quotas? And I'll start with you, Libby.
Thanks, Beth. And hello, and it's nice to see everybody, and thank you to the organizers and the center for having us. Okay, so the question is sort of how this law affected people on the move, how they navigated that, and that, which is something I tried to think about in that book that you mentioned. But for me, as I think for a lot of people here speaking here today, the discussion of this era is happening, for me, it's happening on a split screen with thinking about the here and now, very, very much so. And in recent years, since writing that book, I've spent a bunch of my kind of work time, not so much doing historical research, but engaging in solidarity work with folks on the border of Mexico and the US, more recently on the border of Spain and Morocco. And so for me, there's sort of a lot of connections that I feel like thinking about 1924 can help us make with the world right now. And so I just wanted to kind of say a couple things maybe about that. And for me, one of the main things, which I know the last panel was also already talking about, is that the law, from the perspective of people on the move, doesn't make people any less in need of moving to where they need to go, right? And so people who are themselves on the move have to figure out what to do in the face of this new law. And these laws that kind of present themselves, or the 1924 law then and laws now, present themselves as sort of keeper of order and stability and safety for people on the move are exactly the opposite, right? So we sort of have to ask if 1924 and the laws now, for whom are they safety and order? And for people on the move, it's more about chaos and risk. And so what the stories that I was finding in my own research were very much about the ways that people continued to try to get where they needed to go, much as people do today, whether that was in keeping with the complexities of the new law, with the new bureaucracies of documentation, with the sort of new kinds of border guarding that were happening, or in violation of the laws. And I think that's sort of true in the past as well as the present.
Great, thank you. Mireya.
I think 1924 presents sort of this interesting period, and it builds on 1917 in a lot of ways, right? So we think of immigrants from the Americas as exempt, again, from this quota system, being able to navigate these borders fairly fluidly. But at the same time, we have the 1924 Immigration Act basically giving a power to, this new entity, the Border Patrol. And as Katie Benton-Cohen said, it's a ragtag small group at the beginning, but as we move into the late 1920s, they actually get more and more, I'm going to say oomph. There are more laws passed, like the Gleason Law, and they literally have more and more power, growing power. And this growing power does a lot for populations that are in this border area. They can be intimidated, they are in fear, but I also think that the other part is the part outside of the Border Patrol, which is the border agents. And these border agents now have these new sites where they're facilitating the migration of people, and by facilitating, at times facilitating, but at times also keeping people out. So if you are considered undesirable, the border agent is the person who will, on the fly, decide what that is, if you are not undesirable. And so these kinds of laws get applied very unevenly. If you are in a group of women, a border agent might say, are you women of ill repute? of a certain age. If you are in a group of people who happen to have a disabled family member, you might not have as easy entry. And so I think for me, the lesson is that, even though it feels for a lot of folks that, folks from the Americas, can navigate these borders and boundaries in an easier fashion, I think there's also a growing underbelly and infrastructure that is really picking and choosing when and how to apply these laws.
Oh, thank you. Nathaniel.
So I think it's very important to see the American legislation in a global context, and it's already been mentioned that other countries in the same period were also passing immigration restriction acts of their own. And so when we look at the Jewish case specifically, it doesn't, as Olivia's already mentioned, it doesn't stop people from migrating. What it does, though, is they'll migrate to different places. And because those acts are being enacted at different times, what we see as first internally within Europe, you'll see Jews, for example, from Eastern Europe, moving to parts of Western Europe. Then the immigration there is also restricted. You see them moving to parts of Latin America. Ultimately, many of the people who go to Latin America are going to try to get to the US, and successfully or not. And then you also see increasing numbers of Jews from different parts of Europe going to British Mandate Palestine. And there, it's going to increase tension between Jews and Arabs in British Mandate Palestine very significantly. You see in 1929, you see in 1936, this including up to and including violence between the groups. So the implications of the Immigration Act of 1924 in the U.S. has ripple effects that are very, very significant globally speaking.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think broadens our perspective from seeing this merely as a national issue, because it clearly is not that. So let me shift gears a little bit. I want to talk about some of the legal dimensions of Johnson-Reed and what they meant. It was a complex piece of legislation that has created in the decades we're talking about both lasting norms and, as one of the sessions before us suggested, notable exceptions for who was and was not an acceptable immigrant. So I want to ask you what you think are some of the most salient legal consequences that resulted from the Immigration Act. And this time, let's start with Nathaniel. Sure.
So I actually want to start with 1921 and the Emergency Quota Immigration Act, which has already been mentioned. Khazia mentioned it, I think, initially. And one of the clauses in that act was that there were exceptions. And some of the exceptions were actors, artists, clergymen, people in learning professions. And that did have an impact. First of all, let me say that wasn't the first time. I think it may have been the Chinese Exclusionary Act of 1882, which made certain exceptions for categories, I think merchants, diplomats, teachers, students. In practice, it was still very, very difficult for members of those categories to get in, but the principle of exceptions was established. Again, in 1921, there were different categories, and of course that does continue to 1965, where we see certain types of professions having a privileged status. Now, in practice for Jews, between the world wars, that had a significant impact on the American Jewish community in a couple of ways. In terms of intellectuals from places like Germany and Hungary, sometimes called like the Martians of Budapest, these Hungarian Jewish scientists and scholars who were involved in the atomic bomb research and so on. The numbers were pretty small, but their cultural impact at places like the New School over here were significant. But one thing that I've focused on in my own research is rabbis, Haredi rabbis, that is both Hasidic rabbis and rabbis primarily from Lithuania, who were Roshei Yeshiva, that is, heads of rabbinic academies, who arrive during the interwar period when we have, massive reduction in Jewish immigration overall. They arrive in significant numbers, and the people who do arrive are at a certain age too, where they're ripe for engaging in activism and institution building, and they arrive at a time when the Orthodox or the Haredi, even more specifically, Jewish community is small, is embattled, but actually, as it turns out, ready for expansion and ready for a generation of new leaders to do that. So it's a kind of perfect joining. And so already in the 30s, this exception, has this impact that then in the 1940s and 50s, and I'll talk, I think, in response perhaps to another question about that period, will transform Jewish, at least one sector of the American Jewish community, that is the rise of Haredi communities, is in a very significant way linked to this leadership class that arrives and starts cultivating things in this period, which no one ever would have predicted that would have been one of the outcomes. It was even a question as to whether rabbis should be included in that exception. Ultimately, it was decided that they should be, and then once they arrive, they engage in community building and institution building.
Well, I think for me, and I guess I will follow your lead and pull it back a little further, is that, again, Johnson Reed builds again on other kinds of policies dealing with people from the Americas and specifically from Mexico. By basically putting this group of people outside of the quota system, we think, well, this should be good, this should be great. But the reality is they're outside of this quota system because growers and employers and other folks who want to see them as temporary labor, not permanent immigrants, temporary labor, push for these exemptions, right? They push hard. It's not because they want to include them in the fabric of society. It's because they see them as coming in, doing work, and leaving. And I think this kind of ethos of like a workforce that can come in, do this work, leave is something we still kind of live with in the present day with guest worker programs. And I think, to be quite frank, it's also this kind of exclusion of in part of this not being included in the quota system that led to this kind of like aha moment by growers in the Department of Labor that, well, if they're not included and we can count them as, kind of temporary laborers, not permanent migrants, then we can actually circumvent other laws and we can begin maybe to even contract them and bring them in and literally build a system whereby we use them, we include them for a little bit, and then we exclude them. And I think that comes to shape a lot about American desires for labor, and especially when it comes to labor in our food system, labor in agriculture, that growers kind of get their way and they teach a master lesson to other employers.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think as the last, some of the previous speakers were also saying we can push it back even further, right, and think about Chinese exclusion in particular, Asian exclusion more generally, and to think about the ways that 1924 drew on and then expanded a lot of the principles really piloted in those earlier migration control efforts. And really left us with a legacy despite the fact that the law was repealed, right? Or, chunks of it was replaced in 1965, but a lot of these really core ideas remain. So the idea, for example, that there's a numerical limit on migration, and that's a good thing and something that states should do. That documentation is something that should be demanded from people on the move, and a really elaborate system of documenting individual folks, individual migrants, and checking up on them via that documentation. And as you were talking about the implementation of the Border Patrol, right? This idea that borders themselves are to be policed and controlled, and that all of those things together kind of continue this earlier project and really cement in place, I think, this notion that migration control is central to the project of being the American state in particular, states around the world more generally, that, if you don't have border control, you don't have a country, as some politicians like to say. Like, if you don't have borders, you don't have a country, right? Like, in fact, what they're talking about here are sort of much more recent legal legacies of this kind of migration control than the idea of, like, actually having a nation itself, right? These things are relatively recent.
Yeah, so, I mean, I can really see at this midway point in the conference the way that the old metaphor that used to be in history books about closing the gates is in fact completely inaccurate, not only because the gates weren't completely closed, but because it really wasn't about, this was more about a series of regulations and legislation and the thick bureaucracy that surrounded it, and exceptions that we see such a legacy of in the present day for the things, for better or worse, that were made as exceptions, which were just as important as the norms for how our idea of immigration developed. I want to ask, because we talked about law and we talked about people on the move who are very much still trying to get in, even if through secondary or tertiary routes, I want to spend a minute and talk about what effects this law going into effect had on communities of immigrants and their children already in the United States. So how did various groups work to oppose, to circumvent, perhaps sometimes to support even the structures that were enacted in that legislation? And Mireya, why don't we start with you?
Well, I'm very interested in how a lot of labor leaders opposed basically Johnson Reed. We had, Samuel Gomper saying, this is going to bring down U.S. wages. This competition for, good jobs is just not. It's not going to lead to good things for U.S.-born citizens. And I think in many ways, I have so many feelings about it, because I read these things and I'm like, labor doesn't see the possibility of actually organizing at this period these workers that are coming in that are considered temporary migrants. But at the same time, I also just sort of see that, folks are really trying to wrap their heads around these models. And I think you're right, that these models in themselves set a tone of expectation, right, of who we are and how we should function as a nation, that we can control these things, that we can control labor competition, that we can control people's crossings, and that would define us, that comes to define our possibilities. This isn't necessarily always the argument that the table is big enough to fit all of us. But no, there's some of us who have prime seats at the table, and let's keep it that way.
So one of the ways that I've been thinking about the Immigration Act of 1924 is that it's the culmination of what you could call intra-white racism. And what do I mean by that? So a couple of people have already mentioned the relationship between the ACT and the eugenics movement. And that also was a global phenomenon, by the way. There were eugenics movements in the Soviet Union, in Brazil, in Germany, of course, and so on, although the United States actually was a leader in the global eugenics movement. But one of the characteristics of eugenics at the time, it's not necessarily remembered so strongly now, was that it was not just about distinguishing whites from non-whites, but also different categories of whites from one another. And so you have racial taxonomies within Europe itself, where Nordic, Alpine, Mediterranean are distinguished from one another. Jews, where exactly they fit into that is actually something that's taken up and debated. And I would say, as I just mentioned, that 1924 is really, in certain ways, well, it's a year that's significant within American eugenics in terms of what are known as anti-miscegenation laws, compulsory sterilization, and this Immigration Act, which prevents precisely those whites who are seen as being inferior to the higher status whites from coming in. And yet, I would also say that there is an ironic after effect of this, which is that the Jews and the Italians who are already in the United States actually have an opportunity to distinguish themselves from the Jews and the Italians that are in Europe, and in fact to become more American without that constant influx of literally hundreds of thousands of Southern Italians especially, and Eastern European Jews. So rather than, let's say, emphasizing kind of the activists within those communities that continue to, and Libby has written about, different organizations like the American Jewish Committee and HIAS and so on, that engaged with the government during this period, there's a sense in which there's also kind of an unconscious and sometimes conscious processes, I would say, of Americanization that are possible, both for members of those communities and for others outside of those communities, because you don't have these waves of immigrants who speak, non-English languages and have different dress and practices and so on. So that's how I would respond to that.
I think, so Renee, I feel like I heard a sort of sadness and frustration about these historical actors when you were talking about the labor leaders, and I think that I have had experienced some of that in regards to the sort of organized Jewish world, American Jewish world, and also more international Jewish world in the time period. And sometimes when I have spoken at events over the last, 6 or 7 years, say, people have in the audience have said, like, well, was there like a Jewish sanctuary movement? Was there a American Jewish? And they really want me to have discovered that and to say yes, and there wasn't. And there are, I think, all kinds of reasons for that, having to do with political decisions at the time and pressures at the time that I could say more about. But that's it's something to have to reckon with. I think that sadness, like looking at the history, like it would be exciting to have those sorts of models historically. But I mean, for me, it also remains really important and powerful that people themselves, like people on the move themselves, were voting, so to speak, with their feet, right? And that often by trying to make the best decisions that they could in the face of these changing laws, whether the 1924 law here or laws and regulations elsewhere, and that individuals and families often were, like, not surprisingly, really supportive of people, whatever their relationship to the law was. So if somebody was coming in violation of US law to the US, like relatives might write a letter to some organization saying, like, they didn't do anything wrong. Like, they were just trying to get to their family here in Cincinnati, can you help them? And for me, that's really important to kind of think about, and also, to think about more generally the urgency of listening, always listening to actually people on the ground who are encountering these laws and having these experiences.
So that makes me want to throw a curveball to this group, but I hope you don't mind, and to ask more, because we've been talking a lot today about legislation and policy on a governmental level, because that's what the Johnson-Reed Act was. But your conversation just now makes me want to ask about networks of, you mentioned family networks, organizational networks that also function in a kind of group dynamic to make things happen outside of legal spheres, sometimes writing to people with influence, but also the way those kinds of networks operate on the ground to try to get people in when the law says they ought to be out. Anybody want to pick up on that at all? You don't have
Well,
to.
you know what? I'm happy to add on to one of the things I was saying before, which is that, as much as the leaders, these rabbinic leaders, benefited from the exemption that I mentioned. They wouldn't have gotten here if it weren't for the work of their followers in the U.S. in many cases. It wasn't obvious to some of the individuals who were actually qualified to come here that they could. We shouldn't assume, especially before the internet, and there were many efforts to try to decrease, even if in legal, in the law you were qualified to come, that didn't mean that people were reaching out to you and say, hey, you know what, you're under this exemption, you come, right? No. So in this case, you had followers in the Hasidim, in the Hasidic case, right, or students. And in fact, one of the interesting things about the Haredi world in the 1930s is that you had movement of American students, American yeshiva students, to Lithuania. Everyone thinks it was a one-way direction, right? Everyone was coming from Eastern Europe, at least in the Jewish case, to the US. And of course, it is true that the rates of return were much lower than other groups that have already been mentioned, like Greeks and Italians and so on. But you did have this phenomenon within the Haredi world of American yeshiva students or young men who could not study in yeshivas in the US because they didn't exist in the same numbers that they're going to as a result of what I've been talking about, who will go back to major yeshivas in Lithuania. And then they will come back to the US, and they form these networks. These are transnational networks that then allow for movement back and forth, including ultimately of what I described earlier as a younger class of leaders who are more able to integrate into American society as well, function in ways that some of the older people would not. And so, absolutely, like when we look in kind of subclasses within the overall population, and I don't think it's just unique to Jews, you will find these kinds of networks that don't express the entire population, but some subpopulation.
The question threw me off because I was thinking to myself, well, again, for folks from Latin America, they're exempt from this quota system for a while, but then they're included, and what this causes is a mismatch. There are employers who want them, but a system that doesn't match the need, right? And for the most part, a system that privileges folks that are illiterate, moneyed classes, and those aren't necessarily the folks who want to come in and take very working class and working poor jobs that the US has to offer, right? And so we also get, across the 20th century, this kind of building of a crazy deportation system that renders this workforce, when they are included in the quota system, even more vulnerable, right? So it's building on vulnerabilities after vulnerabilities through policy and law. And when you ask this question, has there been people or groups or networks who've kind of had other visions and who face the system and really try to do something distinct? Yeah. I mean, there are plenty of folks that, get deported in 1930 that find their way back in 1940. There are people who get deported in 1950 who figure out with their family networks, with other networks, how to get back. I think about my own family, facing kind of moments of deportation. I think the real difference now for me in the contemporary period is it's becoming so much more difficult, right? And it's so weird, especially at least when I teach. My students have such a kind of, pre-Trump years, had such a narrative of progress, of American progress, right? That we're in a better time now than before. And now it's kind of ended, right? And the last couple of years have taught them that we actually need to safeguard our, civil liberties and our civil rights in ways, right? Because now they see it quite distinctly. But when I started teaching, they had this kind of positive notion. And for me to say to them, my father was deported several times, right? And he made his way to get a green card finally and figure out how to become, a Teamster. So I lived a pretty good quality of a working class life because he always says, your straight teeth, due to the Teamsters. Your good health, brought to you by the Teamsters. So I think, in a lot of ways, there are always people who kind of look at these systems, as you say, Libby, and try to figure out how to navigate them in their family lives and their work lives and, face these kind of tremendous odds to try to build a good life for themselves, despite all of the, all of the circumstances. So, across the 20th century, that is what I see that folks do. They do face it.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I have to add to what you both said, but I think the networks question is a really interesting one, and maybe one way to think about restrictions, like state restrictions on mobility, right, efforts at migration control, is that it really highlights or makes manifest something that was always true, which is that migration is not a thing that just happens. It is something that people have to work really hard to make happen, and in the face of more barriers, more legal barriers, bureaucratic barriers, physical barriers, there's that much more labor that primarily people on the move themselves and then their family networks and then to some extent larger community or organizational networks have to do. And one thing that's been really striking to me, or that I learned from people in the present world trying to do a lot of solidarity work with folks on the move, is how much states actually rely on these networks to do the work that states kind of fantasize, if states can fantasize, they themselves are doing. So the work of kind of sorting people and helping them figure out documentary requirements and all those things. So those networks actually are like now baked into the system of migration control itself, which is strange, even as they continue to push back as well.
Yeah, so thank you. I think it's very interesting for us to think about how this really happens. And all these stories of how people are deported and eventually get back in, and how long a history this really is really insightful, and I appreciate that. I want to remind everyone that people are walking up and down the aisles with note cards for you, and we'll take your questions in just a few minutes, so please do ask them. So we've talked a lot, I think today, not surprisingly, about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and of course, historian Erica Lee gave us this great phrase, making that act made the United States into a gatekeeping nation. Which I think our discussion and previous ones have really highlighted. And Johnson Reed took that even further and has, I think, changed. It's a notable point in the evolution of the American state. And I wonder if I could ask, how you see the American state having changed because of Johnson Reed in ways that have really lasting implications. And so if you could reflect, you can choose to, but I ask for one way that, especially in these critical years, that this legislation really redefined America as a nation and as a society. So Libby, why don't we start with you?
That's not a big enough question. I'm sorry. So, and I know that people earlier in the day have spoken to this as well. I mean, I think for me it comes back to something that we've been talking about already, which is what I understand to be a real myth at the heart of the United States' idea of itself, which is this idea that controlling migration, controlling borders is central to sovereignty, to the national project, to having a polity that is consisting of the people, that it gets to choose. But I think, like, for me in my own research, part of what was interesting was not kind of encountering that myth or the making of it in and of itself, but because what I was wrestling with was the way that as soon as there are laws meant to control movement, there is necessarily, because of people's real lives and needs, resistance to those laws, that this refrain that we hear in our political life, in our national discourse, that the system is broken, is super bizarre, because in fact there was never a moment when the system was not broken. Like, it was always already a mess. I was about to say something profane, but then thought better of it. It was always already, right, a very messy system. And that, in fact, what that helps kind of highlight is that we're not going to go back to some unbroken moment because there was never like a golden age of migration control. But instead, what we see is the perpetual creation and then recreation of that myth itself. Like, that's what the architects of the policies were enshrining in national life, is that fantasy of control and insistence on control and enforcement rather than the reality of it.
I think for me, it's some of the legacies, again, are this kind of way in which we create policies that render a workforce more and more vulnerable. So across all of these immigration policies, we do have this system that's always been a hot mess, but we also have a system that literally creates and preys on certain people. And to me, the saddest thing is it's the people who literally feed us, literally do tons of things for us every day, and they're not by design going to have entry. And we live in these kinds of reiterations of these systems that by design aren't going to let them enter in the same ways. And so, when I think about, again, my dad, I think about this reality that, like, I have guest worker cousins. Now, will they have the same opportunity as my father? Will they have the same life as my father and his kids? Probably not. Probably not. And it's, again, by design. And it's by design to create a very vulnerable workforce that's out of sight, out of mind. We don't have to think about them every day, but they're definitely there.
So I think that, among other things, the 1924 Act reifies the idea that being in a place for a long time is the norm, and that moving or migrating is the unusual thing that has to be regulated and so on. And I'm not sure if you look at human history that actually bears out. And I can say, so the last two things I want to say about this is that, first, if you look at Jewish history, certainly, there are certain exiles or expulsions that are very well known, like the Spanish expulsion. But if you look more broadly, there is multiple expulsions and exiles. And that's actually, in spatial terms, one of the characteristics of Jewish history in the longue durée is how often different Jewish communities have been expelled from one place to the other. And those are just involuntary expulsions. And of course, we have, voluntary migrations. If I think, people have been talking about their families. If I think about my father was a war refugee, but then his parents had already migrated internally within Europe, and their parents had also, and so on down the line. And that was the norm for a lot of people. Now, of course, there were other people who lived in the same place for a long time, but we shouldn't privilege one over the other, is what I'm saying. And we are entering into an era that for many, perhaps billions of people around the world, migration will be the norm. Multiple migrations. And internally within the US, people will be migrating because of climate change and so on. So I think we have to be more open-minded, as it were, about whether this is an exception that has to be regulated in these ways, or whether actually it's just, we're as a species going to be moving back and forth. And we should be more sensitive to that, of our fellow human beings, who are in that situation.
So thank you very much. I've been reading through the questions submitted, and I think they fall into categories of wanting information from the panelists and asking for some comparisons and perspectives. So I'm going to start with the informational ones. Because it's come up in our panel and in previous sessions, this question of what came before any kind of immigration acts, exclusion, and pre-border control. So I have a question that says, well, what was there was it all open borders? How did migrants come in and out of the United States before this time? And that is a very good question, by the way, because we haven't really explained it here. So if that's something you can speak to, and there were questions that I don't expect you could speak to, but if you can, about other nations and how they do this kind of thing, if you happen to know. That's a big question. Anybody want to tackle that one? No?
Well, I will say for other nations, so one of the things I've been talking a lot about is, this kind of structure that relies on temporary workers that then gets codified as guest workers, right, and contract workers, and, making this kind of population highly controllable, and across the 20th century becomes more and more controllable. We have managed to export that model globally. And so that is the model that is alive and well in several European countries and several Middle Eastern countries. And so our model of exploitation, we've managed to convince everybody that it works.
That's another really enormous question.
Yes.
So not to speak to the, list all the turning points or whatever, but just to think about the ways to give a shout out to the ways that that the idea of controlling migration and controlling borders was something that accrued or happened in the United States, but elsewhere as well, really gradually over time. So there were some large turning points, 1882, 1924, really important turning points, but that something like the system of border control that you experience if you cross say the U.S.-Mexico border today was not in place 100 years ago or 120 years ago, right? And you can different scholars and other folks have traced the history of that evolution of that sort of control in a way that helps us understand that it didn't just emerge out of the egg, right? Fully formed. It has accrued, and that is true both in terms of the law and in terms of the kind of physical manifestations of the law or of the enforcement of the law, deportation policy, for example. So that's again, not a lot of concrete information, but I have great reading recommendations if anyone wants.
So I would point out that the idea of borders itself we shouldn't just take that as a natural phenomenon, right? And certainly the idea of nation states being defined by very discrete borders, and then immigration between nation states with borders and borders control is also something that has to be historicized, that it hasn't always existed. And then specifically when it comes to the Jewish experience, that actually that's a case where it wasn't simply, or for a long time, movement between borders of nation states to some degree because they didn't yet exist, but actually movement within states was regulated. And Jews weren't allowed to move between certain areas and other areas, or to live within certain regions or other regions or towns of a certain size or cities and so on. So we should also think about internal migration. And the Jewish case is a really striking example of that it's not simply borders between nation states that are the ways in which people have regulated movement and migration. But actually, in some places, like the Russian Empire, which is massive, if we think about in terms of territory, being able to move within that entity is at least in scale as significant as being able to move from one state to another within certainly the European context or even within the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, I'll also comment that not just, as a follow-up to what you said, it was very common, Jews knew it well, to have controls on populations without such things as borders, like limits on how many Jewish families could live in a particular town or city, and once you came of marriageable age, you couldn't, if that number wasn't going to be raised, you couldn't marry and settle there, you'd have to go somewhere else. So that wasn't a border issue, but it was controlling the number of what was considered at least, if not undesirable, just tolerated people. So I would say that there's borders, and this idea of defining it through nation states is relatively new, but society is trying to control the populations, that they live in is actually, I think, not so new. But there were different ways of doing it than this kind of legislation. As you can see, I've been given a great deal of questions that I'll never be able to get through, but I'm going to try to synthesize a few of them. And a couple of questions had to do with offering comparisons between different groups. And one of the things I will say this conference has tried to do is not to have a conference simply about Jewish immigration, but, as others have said before me, to understand this more broadly as an immigration issue and an attitude towards migrants and seeing the commonalities. But a few of the questions are asking me about distinctions. How do we understand different groups, how they're classed, meaning are they considered a race? Are they considered an ethnicity? Are they considered a religious group? I'm pulling many questions together in one, so you'll forgive me. And if and how that had an impact in enforcement at certain times. So I know I'm throwing a lot at you. Pick any one of those strands.
That's a lot of strands.
I know. Pick one. Pick your favorite.
Well, at least from Latin America, I mean, this is not one cohesive racial group, right? And that's what we know that. You can be from Latin America and you can be Afro-Latino, you can be indigenous, you can actually also just be white. So for the most part, for that specific, for that sort of category of immigrants, I would say those experiences are quite diverse as well, because again, there's that mismatch. Employers want working class, working kind of poor folks to enter these jobs that aren't going to have very much upward mobility, right? And the folks who can come in, who are documented from particular countries in Latin America, are not sometimes of the same kind of class background at all. And so there definitely is a lot of class variation, but the reality is if you are, working poor and trying to get over here and you just so happen to be Mexican, good luck if you want to do it legally, because the line is very long and you will wait on that queue. First, you will have to pay a hefty price to get into that queue, and you will have to wait a whole lot longer than anyone else in those queues. And so I think, there's just, again, that, I can't say it anymore, but that mismatch, the desire to want this population to be working class, but then to come here and cross, quote unquote, through a documented fashion, you'd actually have to be upper class to do that.
So I think one way of let's say, reframing the question is there a competition between groups? And is it, to some extent, a zero-sum game, or has it been in some periods of American history, as to which immigrants can come in and which can't? And if some come in, does it mean that others can't? And does the interests of one, let's say, interfere with the interests of another? And although our panel ends at World War II, or with World War II, and then the next one is going to pick up in 1965, I think the period between World War II and 1965 is interesting in this respect, and the question of refugees, which we really haven't talked a lot about. And one of the ways I thought about responding to the 1924 Immigration Act question, its legacy, is not about what was in it, but what wasn't in it, which is that refugees weren't in it, and that the notion of refugees is a discrete class. And actually, Madalena has written about this in her book in terms of displaced persons and the Displaced Persons Act of 1948. Then it went through revision in 1950, 1952, and the emergence of the category of refugee and how that was very contested. And it was contested by groups in the US, by Italians, by Jews, by their organizations, but it was also contested among politicians as to which groups of the millions of displaced persons, as they were called, which ones of those should be given preference, or at all should they be given preference, but which ones should be given preference. Now, you might have thought, given what happened during the Holocaust, that Jews would be given preference. That was not the case. In fact, agricultural workers as a category were given preference initially among displaced workers, which did not privilege Jews. Okay, so you end up with only about 15,000 Jews arriving in 1945 and around 96,000 Jews between 1945 and I think 1950, when they do then get some benefit. Many more Jews go to Palestine and then once it's created, Israel. So again, these things have significant implications globally in places that you wouldn't imagine what happens in the US. And on the other hand, you have a German, ethnic German or Slavic immigrants getting into the US, as displaced persons, which is not the image that a lot of people have of displaced persons and of those arriving in the US. So I guess that's a question too. It's so complicated, and sometimes there are surprises as to who's going to be prioritized and who isn't, and along the lines of what you talked about with race and religion and so on.
And surprises, right, that have to do with the amount of pressure through media and other campaigns that come about. Do you want to?
Sure, I mean, just to add, and this is actually, Madalena, goes back to something you said in the last panel, I think, which is that although the 1924 law had sweeping effects for lots of folks, including for Jews coming from various countries in Europe, the law itself and then the implementers of the law were not regarding all incoming people in the same way, even if they were people who were violating the law. So for example, in my own research, I was running into reports in the 1920s of all sorts of folks who were hoping to get into the United States around the law by coming from Cuba, by being usually in Havana, and then trying to come from Havana to Florida or New Orleans. And it was cheaper for European folks, including Jews, to get smugglers to take them in than it was for Chinese folks to get smugglers to take them in, because the presumption of illegality was so much, I mean, there were different reasons, but including that the sort of presumption of illegality was much higher in the ongoing era of Asian exclusion, whereas, I mean, Madalena, you pointed out that there was still legal, blessed, like sort of sanctioned migration from Europe, and so there was a way that even people violating the law could kind of make a case for how they were not violating the law. So there were definite racial inequities and complexities in that, just in terms of how the implementers were thinking, or you were talking about the folks, actually making these person-by-person decisions on the border, what they were thinking about based on who they imagined somebody was. So there were these very on-the-ground differences.
Yeah, thank you for that. We're at the end of the hour, but since we started 2 minutes late, I'm going to take one more of these questions, and it's another one of these counterfactual questions that I don't really believe in as a historian, but I'm going to ask it anyway because it's kind of interesting. One of the comments noted that, of course, we got this problem of, we created problems at the border through the implementation of these laws. But other than that, so I'm putting together two questions. Other than that, someone asked, what did the US lose, or if you wanted to put in how did the American state that enacted these legislations and implemented them through all these bureaucracies, what did they not see in terms of advantages that these immigrants might bring at this, especially at this moment that we're talking about in the interwar years? If you want to think about it as what, this is not my question, this came to us, but I thought it was interesting to think about what we lost out on, what Americans lost out on by this. Take a step.
Okay, so this isn't quite going by the rules of your question, I guess, but I mean, in some ways, it just makes me really sad to think of the terms of the question about being about like what can the nation gain from people, like as though it's sort of a human resources issue. And of course, I mean, to some extent, right, the whole debate about labor, like there are human resources issues, but I mean, it's one of the things I found myself thinking about in recent times on the US-Mexico border, for example, on the border of San Diego and Tijuana, during the pandemic, was thinking about, and this isn't about a gain, it's about a loss, but then sort of imagining what could happen if you didn't have this loss, thinking about just the immense amount of resources, like military-grade border guarding resources, poured into the project of securing borders in the midst of a pandemic that was demanding that we think about other kinds of resources really differently, right? And in fact, those things got really linked as the United States implemented a policy that pretended that on the basis of contagion, it was not even letting people make asylum claims at the border, right? But was in reality just turning that into another form of border guarding. So I think, you know, to imagine in the same way that here in New York, we might imagine like, what would we do with all those resources that we're now using to pay cops and National Guard people to patrol our subways? Like we could ask, you know, what, the amount that we could have gained by not, as a nation, investing and using those resources in border policing and surveillance and the entire apparatus of migration control, it's like, sky's the limit, you know, like we could be doing all kinds of things. So that's not an answer that's thinking about just the, you know, the sort of human capital of people arriving and what they could do for a culture, because I don't like to really think about humans that way, but thinking about resources and what the nation might be deploying them to do. Is that fair?
Yeah. So I want to make sure I'm conveying, which I probably did not, the spirit of the question to me, which was, I think, turning on its head the notion that those who passed this legislation believed that they were preserving the nation in some way. So if you turn that question on its head and said, you know, were they really preserving the nation? But, you know, obviously not. Like what would have been the alternative had they thought differently about what preserving the nation might mean?
I think, I mean, what we lost, or even what we lose in the present day when we don't allow people to be full participants in society. We lose a lot of talent, we lose a lot of new inquiry, new perspectives, and, you know, for the most part, at least, you know, on the border, what I'm obsessed with sometimes is like, we lost a whole lot of like incredible radicals who had different visions for the US. We lost so many people who were deported, who thought and pushed back and thought, the world doesn't have to be this way, and the US doesn't have to be this way. And I mean, I think, you know, I think about like people like Luisa Moreno, right? She's Guatemalan, she's organizing in the 1930s, 1940s, she's, you know, deported, but actually they issue her deportation. She decides to leave on her own accord. But she said these beautiful things in this pamphlet, right? She said, they can deport me, but they can't deport what I stand for and all the people whom I've worked with. And I thought to myself, man, what world would I have lived in if people like her would have been allowed to stay and really build on US radical traditions in ways, you know, that were phenomenal, exciting, because when those folks are deported, we do lose a lot.
I don't really have anything to add.
That's okay. So I think I've gone over our time a little bit, but I just want to say in closing before we thank this fabulous panel is that, you know, where we are now in this part of the conference, we've really talked about something that isn't so simple in terms of even when quotas are in effect, that this is not such a simple thing as certain people get in and get out. People are still moving. This is a global issue, and this is a human issue. And I hope this panel has helped bring those things to light. Thank you for this wonderful panel.